Welcome to THINKpod. My name is Francisco.
And I'm Aziz, and at ThinkPod, we speak about the smartest ideas and the biggest challenges facing the world right now. We speak about where we are, how we got here, and where we're going.
In this episode of ThinkPod, we talk to Khaled Talhouni, managing partner at Nuwa Capital, about their self-styled radical approach to investment, and we ask what he sees as the catalyst for the major increase in venture capital funded startups in the MENA region, and the role of ESG in how we think about investing in growing successful businesses.
Mr. Khaled, how are you doing today?
Fine, thank you for having me. Really appreciate your time.
So with over 15 years of experience in the region, Nuwa Capital identifies itself as having a radical approach to investment. Just how radical are you?
So I think our main focus is that myself and the team, we've been investing in entrepreneurs and early stage technology companies well before there were many tech entrepreneurs to speak of. We've seen that kind of shift in a massive way, and given our experience in the space, we want to build a platform that allows us to really drive value to the founders and entrepreneurs we work with. And I think that's the radical shift in a way, or at least the first part of it, which is, capital is quite commoditized. It's available. There's an abundance of capital. So I think where we want to kind of do a paradigm shift in the way venture capital investing works in this market and emerging markets more broadly is how do we drive kind of more value to the founders we work with. And the first way we do that is we're kind of a multi-product platform. So we do early stage VC, we do venture debt. We're looking to start launching venture debt to hopefully grow our asset base into growth capital and other markets as well. So we have sort of a kind of a wider platform to invest with. And the other big thing is we want to drive subject matter expertise to the companies we work with. So we have basically like a network of freelancers that we work with that are subject matter experts in specific domains like product, tech, growth hacking, marketing, recruitment, etc. We make these available for our underlying portfolio companies to help them grow and develop. And I think it's like an evolutionary thing. We want to continue figuring out how we drive value to our portfolio companies in the long run. The other big thing we do is we partner with our investors around very specific sectors. So we have investors that look at healthcare, we have investors that look at F&B, others in kind of logistics, etc., where we act as the bridge between our investors and our portfolio companies so that they can learn from each other and get some value from each other as well.
You're also expanding into emerging markets like East Africa and so on. Could you talk about that further?
Yeah, I think we think of the region as a wider economic bloc. I mean, our most successful investment in the past was Careem. We were an early investor in Careem that exited to Uber. And one of the reasons that was the largest exit in the region is they were able to aggregate the region from Pakistan to Turkey to the GCC to Morocco. Once you kind of aggregate that larger economic bloc, that's a very, very sizable economy. And I think that's core to our thesis. How do we kind of operate across multiple markets? And that's how you have like sizable outcomes. Obviously, these are very different geographies. And even within the Arab world or within the MENA region, they're quite distinct. Egypt's not like the GCC, it's not like the Levant, etc. But I think the problems that technology entrepreneurs are solving resonate across these regions are quite similar because you do have structural issues, whether that's in financial services or in logistics or in transportation, etc., that do translate to some degree across these markets. And so we want to take the learnings from the GCC, apply them to Pakistan, apply them to Egypt, apply them to North Africa, etc. So that's kind of the type of thinking that we have in terms of aggregating the region.
You launched Nuwa Capital at the beginning of 2020. That's a year that nobody could have predicted, right? Now, people say hindsight is 2020, but looking back, what do you wish you could have told yourself?
So, very good question. So I left my last, where I used to run another fund early on to kind of set up this platform in February 2020. And literally, we announced the launch of the platform. We still needed to raise the capital. And then, within a few weeks, the world had shut down and markets were collapsing and like the world was changing, etc. So I'd be lying if I didn't say it freaked me out a little bit, especially since there's a lot of like my partners joined me who I convinced to kind of join me as well, who also, I was responsible for, whether they're the investors or my kind of operating partners who I work with. What we found is like over the course of 3-4 months was that as the markets rebounded, it seemed like COVID shifted the entire narrative and accelerated digital transformation in an incredible way. So in some sense, we were quite fortunate. If I was to tell myself something, in hindsight, would have been to move faster and to really kind of seize that opportunity before it came. We could have benefited from launching a couple of months earlier, probably. But overall, I hate to say it because so many people around the world have suffered. I think COVID indirectly was a good thing for us because it really pushed technology and our industry to the forefront and really kind of enabled people to think about different ways of doing things.
So you underwent an experience that I feel like you see a lot of entrepreneurs go through, right? Starting something in times of uncertainty and more uncertainty is thrown upon you. How was that challenge personally for you? And then how did it shape your relationship moving forward with both entrepreneurs as well as investors, having been in that position yourself?
That's a great question. So I think I've always been on the investing side, which is kind of suboptimal for someone in VC. And that's always been, easier for my personality, the way I think, etc. But the uncertainty around COVID really made us think in kind of different ways and really kind of, created so much uncertainty. I felt like a, startup founder in a way, which I hadn't really felt that much before. Even though creating the new platform in a way is a startup, but it's much more a slow burn rather than, the fast pace of a startup. So it really kind of changed, the way we think. I think the biggest thing that we've adopted is this sense that are the partners, our investors, or the people we work with, they're really family, right? And the only way you can transcend these types of crises is if you adopt, for lack of a better word, like a familial approach to like how you deal with all your stakeholders. And I think that's the way we kind of evolved and changed. So we bring in our investors, they're a big part of our team. They own part of our GP. We work with them, we're totally transparent with them. On the team side, I think we adopted this sense of kind of radical transparency. Everybody sees everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly, as much as is possible. Something that we're trying to do is like have this idea where kind of also push any idea throughout the team and also with our partners and our investors is, how do we leverage these networks to create like a marketplace of ideas within the firm that can kind of rise to the top. I think that's the biggest challenge that we're kind of trying to do to make sure that we're able to grow. We're small now, but hopefully as we grow, we can keep that kind of sense of family within the firm and push that forward. So that's kind of changed a bit of my thinking in terms of having to be really close with all your partners and really have to treat them in the same way you might treat family.
We're definitely witnessing a coming of age in the MENA region for tech startups. What, in your opinion, is the catalyst for that?
I think what's really interesting is and different parts of the MENA region are, they vary, right? They have their own issues, but there are kind of deep-seated structural economic issues within the region. And what's really interesting is that tech entrepreneurship allows, at a high level, individuals to seize their own economic destiny as opposed to wait for kind of like the state to kind of help support them. And that's kind of the most radical shift. And what's validated this model is the growth of companies like Careem, like InstaShop, like Jahiz. So there are now like large businesses whose valuations have grown, whose founders have exited, and there are thousands upon tens of thousands of people who have worked at those companies who've all been bitten by that bug. So those people, kind of mid-level management who've participated in the stock option plan or have had exposure to that kind of culture and that type of dynamism, they're never going back to like McKinsey or like PwC or like Unilever or whatever, right? That's never happening again. Those days are gone, And so you have a whole class of the most educated, the most switched on in society who want to now build things. And I think that at the supply of startups, at the kind of origination side, that's what's kind of driven a lot of like the growth of startups. And then in terms of the outcomes, the positive outcomes, I think you're seeing governments being a lot more positive in terms of policy. You're seeing a lot more capital flow to the asset class as a result of COVID. And so there's fuel to really help drive these companies forward. So those two things together, I think, is what's bringing the MENA region into its own when it comes to VC and startups.
So you mentioned a couple of good examples. I mean, you talked about Careem, you gave the example of Jahiz as well. Some people might say that these companies might be copycats. They're just adopting a solution that worked somewhere else, planting it here, making it work here. Do you think, are we going to be victims in the region perhaps of copy-paste, or is there something that excites you about the novelty of entrepreneurship in the region? Are there any particular cities, countries, businesses that you think there's novelty there or something exciting that you personally like?
Yeah, so I think the first wave of innovation in most emerging markets comes in this kind of copy-paste model. Someone once told me it's like copy-paste, innovate, because you're adapting for local requirements. So Careem was able to, its small innovation was that people wanted to pre-order rides here, and you can pay in cash because people don't like to use credit cards, which was kind of totally different to Uber, right? So that type of adaptation, that type of localization is critical. So there is innovation within the copy-paste model. However, I think as we go forward, you'll find founders solving for problems that are idiosyncratic to this region or their kind of geographies. And technology allows them to do that. So for one example, within financial services generally, the MENA region is one of the least banked regions in the world, right? Even within the GCC, access to credit is incredibly complicated and difficult for both firms and individuals. Different technology business models like transcend traditional financial institutions like banks. So that's kind of the type of adaptation that will become local that you don't see elsewhere in the world. In East Africa, we invested in a company in the past also called Twiga, which is a marketplace connecting farmers to kind of retail in urban centers, and they do all the logistics in between. And this is not that relevant in developed markets where that supply chain is quite robust, but in developing markets and emerging markets, that's typically highly fragmented, very broken, very complicated. So that's the type of kind of very local innovation that kind of we're really interested in.
So Khaled, I actually had a follow-up to that because you talked about the next wave would be adapting to idiosyncrasies that are present in the region or in any region, right? With more and more social media and technology, I think all of us are consuming the same content. We're kind of becoming more convergent in the way we think and approach life, right? We have the same musicians we like. We watch the same shows on Netflix, we travel to the same destinations. Where do you stand on that debate? Do you feel like the world is becoming more convergent, where like values and cultures are becoming more uniform, or do you think people are going to retain some hold of that? And how do you see that in light of entrepreneurship?
So on kind of a socio-political level, you have two great global movements. On the first level, you have this kind of global elite who have done very well over the past 20 years. And I don't mean the top 1%, I mean like the top 20%, the professional class within, a certain upper middle class within these countries, even who did very well during COVID, for example. And these people, wherever you are, you're in, you could be here in the Middle East, you could be in the US, you could be in Europe or Latin America, wherever. They've done well, and their values and their system of beliefs are converging very quickly. And then there's people in the middle, and then there's 30-40% who are not kind of benefiting from that growth in a meaningful way yet, and they're actually going the other way. So they see their economic misfortunes tied up with a kind of cultural alienation, and you see people going to the corners. You saw that in with Brexit and with Trump. You see that in our part of the world with sort of cultural conservatism, and you see that in different places in the world. So there's sort of two competing ideological forces. And I think they have to, in a way, evolve together to be resolved. Otherwise, we're going to have a massive kind of issue, I think, in the long run. So that's something to be kind of played out. It's difficult to see how that's going to work. In terms of how entrepreneurship plays into that, again, we see entrepreneurship as being one of the greatest leveling forces in terms of income inequality, which fuels some of this conflict. So by seizing your own kind of economic destiny, by becoming an entrepreneur, working in an entrepreneurial company, you're able to kind of break free of that sort of economic cap. It's easier said than done, but I think, we strongly believe that entrepreneurship helps to kind of alleviate some of these pressures in some way.
Do you think venture capital has a responsibility to be a catalyst for social drive in some of these regards?
No. Different people think very differently to this, but I've always found that if you try to do social impact as the goal, then you're basically undermining the mission, which is to kind of build great companies, right? The social impact is the byproduct. It's not the goal itself, right? I think it's a little small nuance, and I sometimes just find it hard to articulate. But I think when you try to just do social impact for impact's sake within a VC or within any kind of capitalistic framework, you end up doing neither well, right? So you can do social impact altruistically through philanthropy, etc., and that's something. Or you can really focus on building great businesses and investing in great businesses. And then the byproduct of building great businesses is all the social impact. But when you try to kind of layer it on top, I've always found it gets messy, and some people are able to do it well, but I found it very complicated to do.
So one question we had, at the FI Institute, we're very big on ESG. One of the last events we had at a very large scale was an ESG focus event where we talked about impact-driven investing. We wanted to hear your thoughts on the specific topic of ESG. Where do you see that? And you have a very interesting viewpoint there about investments for the sake of social impact. Where do you see ESG falling into place, and if there's any pros and cons to ESG right now?
Yeah, the way I think about ESG is that it's part and parcel of building great companies. So you have to be environmentally conscious because your stakeholders want you to be environmentally conscious, whether those are the investors or your customers. Similarly with governance, right? Like you have to have great governance to be able to build great companies, and you have to have a great, way of conducting business to be able to grow. So they sort of come part and parcel, if you see what I mean. So I think ESG is a critical part of how we think about investing. You also find increasingly capital is more concerned with ESG, not just for altruistic reasons, but also because that is key to building better and better companies. I think it's hard to not have ESG at the core of your mission while you're trying to build like a large kind of successful business.
You seem a proponent of solutions that are tackling those problems, the climate, energy, pressing problems. Why do you think we're not seeing enough investments there? Why are investors gun shy at pulling the trigger at those problems and doubling down? I mean, we saw at COVID, a lot of investment money went into healthcare. And look at the remarkable results we had. But why are we being gun shy at the more pressing long-term problems?
So I think because some of them are like slow-moving problems, whereas COVID is quite immediate, right? So you said like 50 years from now, right? So just the human nature is such that you could only deal with this kind of sense of immediacy, right? But having said that, I think you see a lot more of, it's topping the agenda now all the time, and I think there's a lot more interest in solving that. Again, not so much locally in terms of homegrown startups solving for those problems, just because we don't have yet a strong kind of deep tech sector. And these are all deep tech questions. If you want to build a cold fusion, then we don't have the kind of infrastructure for it here yet. But we will have the applications for that going forward. So I think that's starting to kind of emerge.
How do you encourage investors to look at these problems and see the potential in them and kind of commit to solving them, believing there will be a return at the end of the tunnel?
There is increasingly realization that this is all very interconnected, and so this is a kind of a global crisis to be addressed. I think in terms of getting investors more and more interested, there has to be validation. I think we mentioned at the top, like why did MENA, just in tech generally, start? Why is it snowballing? What's happening? It's because you had good, sizable outcomes, and more of them are coming. Whereas there weren't any. I think the minute you have commercial validation that these companies are successful, they do well, you'll start having a snowball effect from there. So we need to focus on building the first or the group of champions, out of which you'd have increasing network effects and people doing more and more stuff around that.
You've talked about a lot of your work and how you're investing and you're looking at different parts of the world. On a personal level, what legacy do you hope to leave as your impact in humanity and for future generations?
I get this incredible satisfaction. It's almost like living vicariously through the founders that we work with. It's seeing them build businesses, right? And the legacy that, I'd love to leave, and I think too young to think about legacy. And too young and not nearly as successful enough. But then I can, once I'm successful, I can worry about legacy. But it's all kind of tied to what gets me motivated, which is, how is really being part of helping in whatever tiny way we can, getting founders to the next stage and building great companies that are solving for big problems, and that in turn, either directly or indirectly, are really making people's lives better. And that's kind of like the thing that is really exciting for me, is why I do what I do, and it's what I'm hoping to achieve in the long run.
Well, thank you so much for joining us at ThinkPod.
Thank you.
We're looking to be a part of that journey as well. Thank you,
Khaled.
Thanks for that.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
We would love you to let others know about this podcast.
So please rate us, leave us a comment, and share with someone who might enjoy it too.
And don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on our next episode.